I'd like to welcome Mr. Pratyaya Amrit, the Secretary and CMD of Energy Department, Government of Bihar. We'd now be starting the session around energy. I request the Chair to take over.
Good morning, everyone. First and foremost, my apologies for coming late. As most of you would be aware, there's a small crisis at hand, and we are just trying to expedite a few of the processes, and we're just coordinating with International Airport Delhi, where our kits have finally arrived. So I'm sorry for that. Let me extend my heartfelt thanks to Mr. Sourabh Gupta for inviting me to be here. This is my first kind of a meeting or a seminar which I'm attending as Secretary Energy and CMD of Bihar State Power Holding Company. In last 30-40 days that I have been around, this is one sector which is certainly very fascinating, but at the same time very challenging. And today we have got an occasion where we are having some very good speakers amongst us. I've had chance of interacting with them. So we begin this session, and I request Mr. Nicholas Ryan. Mr. Nicholas Ryan studies energy markets and environmental regulation in developing countries. He has recently joined Yale University as Colls Foundation Fellow for 2014-15 and an assistant professor of economics from 15 onwards. He holds a PhD in economics from MIT, and as he was at Harvard till recently. So I request Nicholas Ryan. Thank you.
We greatly appreciate it. And also to the IGC, especially Dr. Gupta and Professor Mukherjee and the IGC country team for organizing this fantastic conference. So we were here last year, and myself and one of my colleagues, Robin Burgess, presented on this project. And the idea today is to give a progress report. At that time, it was basically a conception phase, and we were thinking of ideas. At this time, the project is well conceived, and we wish to present some preliminary results. So this work is joint. I am joined by Robin Burgess of the LSC, but also of the IGC, a founder and director of the IGC, as well as Michael Greenstone, who is co-director of the IGC Energy Program, and Anant Sudarshan. So it was just sort of mentioned that the idea of this assemblage is to come up with a formula for growth. That is obviously a very tall order, but starting out this sort of International Growth Center conference, what are the ingredients that we think might go into that formula? There are several things that we're very sure of. One is health, that people who are healthy are more capable, more productive, they live longer, they invest in their lives and their children, and that benefits the economy as well. Second would be education, that people who are educated can achieve more, sort of make more empowered decisions in their own lives, and also be better citizens and more productive workers in the economy. And last would be sort of business productivity, the idea of village enterprise or any enterprise, and growth in productivity over time. So what does any of this have to do with electricity? Is electricity number 4 on this list? I don't think electricity is number 4. I think rather electricity is behind all of these. That is, in a modern economy, electricity touches each of these ingredients for growth, as well as almost every other aspect of life that you could think of. And so the concrete examples I have in mind are when it comes to health, if you're lighting your home with kerosene, that's polluting, and there's particulate matter inside your home that's going to hurt your lungs and shorten your life. When it comes to education, you need time and light to study. You need perhaps a computer to draft a document, to connect to other people. When it comes to productivity, you can hardly think of a business, be it in manufacturing or in services, that can survive without access to electricity. So electricity is not number 4, it's every number. And when you think about that and the impact that electricity has on growth through all of these myriad channels, it makes you very concerned about the inequality in electricity consumption around the world and even across India. So this is circa 2010, the average per capita electricity consumption in Bihar, in India, and in the United States. And in Bihar, the level of electricity consumption is 122 kilowatt hours per annum. Again, this figure is slightly out of date for comparison purposes. That's about 1/6 of the Indian level and about 1/100th of the United States level. And that's even greater than the difference in income between Bihar and the United States. So the question is, given that the electricity supply is so scarce, and yet we think electricity is so powerful for growth, what can Bihar do to try to use electricity as a tool to enable growth and rather than a barrier? And what is happening, and this has just been happening in the last sort of year or 2 years, is that Bihar is undertaking a transformation of the power sector to try to match the transformations that it has achieved in the last 10 years in roads, in crime, law and order, and in education. And that's a recognition of the sort of interconnected nature of electricity with all of these other aspects of growth. So when we're talking about lighting up Bihar, this is a research project, but it's really one leg of this larger effort by the state to use electricity as a tool for growth rather than being an obstacle as it's been till now. And I think that, you know, in any other place, it might be somewhat overambitious to make some claim about transformation, but, you know, as the sort of initial panel alluded to, that transformation is possible here, and I really think that that's what the leadership has in mind with respect to electricity. What can sort of research and JPAL and IGC in particular do to aid this? So I'll describe the project design at length, but basically our team is of economists. We are experts in incentives, and in particularly the problem here is in part that there's very low rates of payment for electricity. So that means if you want to expand supply, you can do that out of the government budget, but over the long term, there needs to be additional revenue collection in order to enable that expansion and fund investment in the sector and fund purchases of power for that growth. So we're helping to design and test a scheme that would make that possible. And the second thing that as researchers we do is to document this change. It's not only to help in a sort of consultancy fashion on the conception of the scheme and how it might be designed, but it's also to mark out as carefully and rigorously as possible the impact that this has on people's lives and on business creation and growth. And so we're undertaking very large-scale household surveys and business surveys to document all of these effects that I mentioned, as well as myriad other aspects, and try to capture this sort of phenomenon of lighting up Bihar and measure those benefits for growth. So today I'm going to talk about firstly, what is a sustainable electricity sector in India today, given the sort of various constraints. And then I'll describe the scheme in particular and briefly the plan for evaluation and scale up of this scheme. So on electricity sort of sustainability, people often speak of independence for a state or for a country. That is somewhat misguided here, because if you look in India, what has happened is there's a great growth in the generating capacity in the private sector, as well as from the states and from the center. And so the consequence of that growth has been falling power prices. If you look from 2009 till the present, power prices have gone from above 7 rupees in short-term markets down to 4 rupees, 3 rupees, even lower if you're sort of canny about your contracts. So there's plenty of power out there to be purchased. And that means that electricity sustainability is not necessarily a sort of physical sustainability, that is of generating all one's power oneself. And Bihar is taking advantage of this power availability. So what has happened, if you look at November 2012, this is an important date because this is just around when the unbundling of the distribution companies has happened. Distribution companies being separated from the generating and transmission arms. If you look on that date, the total availability, the load of power in Bihar is about 1,250 megawatts. That's very slight. To give a basis from comparison, that's about a quarter of the load in Delhi, the city of Delhi alone. But what has happened is, as of the end of this fiscal, that is more than doubled. So the power availability in Bihar is now 2,400 megawatts as of the end of the prior fiscal year. And if you looked as on today, I'm sure the Secretary could give the exact figure, but it's significantly above that figure even. And that's what happens when you have a rate of growth which is doubling in the course of 1 year, is that almost any figure I put up is going to be out of date. And what's more, that is the sort of aggregate availability of power. There have been significant strides on other dimensions of customer service, of metering, and so forth. And so if you look at the start, what this figure shows is the number of customers on the left, and then moving to the right, the number of customers that are metered, the number of those meters that are read, and the number of customers that are paying. So this is very important because that base of revenue ultimately comes only from those customers on the far right-hand side. And you can see that those are far fewer than the total number of customers, which is about 40 lakhs. And 40 lakhs, about 4 million people, that is a small fraction of the population of Bihar. So you can see that the electricity customers are only an elite group from that point of view. But what has happened, these blue bars are all, again, circa November 2012, that is when sort of the unbundling is about to happen, is that the total number of customers have increased by over sort of 2 lakh, and the number who are metered has increased even more dramatically, so from sort of 29 to 39 lakhs, which is a huge, huge change. And the number of those meters that are read has also increased, and this is very manpower intensive, so it's not just sort of the installation of the meter, but the fact you have to get out there every month and read how that consumption has changed. And moreover, the number of paying customers has increased dramatically. So this is huge progress in the course of 1 year, albeit from a very low sort of starting base for many of these measures. And the sort of aggregate or summary measure of progress might be this figure, which shows the aggregate losses. That is the share of power which is not billed for to any customer. And the top line, the red line, is the actual rate of loss, which is about 45, 46%. And you can see just in the last year, is there a decline. So it's the first decline since 5 years, which is very important, but it's still very modest, and it's much smaller than the increase on those other measures. And the reason for that, in part, is there's been a massive increase in supply, and that supply is going to these customers who are, by and large, paying at very low rates. So therefore, the rate of loss has not come down, even as the supply has increased. So what does that mean? What is the consequence? Of course, power supply in the short term, that increase is fantastic. But the question is to carry that forward. There's a sort of set amount of resource that could be used, that could be invested in this sector. So every rupee of revenue which is increased can be reinvested in greater supply and stronger grid infrastructure. So now we're going to talk a little bit about how that might be done. That's sort of a very tall order. And I think the right way to start is to just break it down a little bit. That if you talk about 46% loss in the state as a whole, that figure, that's a daunting figure, and no one could address that sort of single aggregate figure. What you need to do is break it down and find out, okay, well, where is the revenue actually coming from? What particular places, what particular customers, and that will allow you to think about, to conceive and implement schemes to try to raise revenue and try to make all of the places look like those places. So from an electricity perspective, this is the only mildly technical thing I'll show. The electricity grid, which you might see going along the road, has many different tiers, many different levels. So it goes from very high voltage transmission lines, carry power the long distances, down to the level of the individual customer. And we believe an important level of this grid is the 11 kilovolt feeder. A feeder supplies basically a neighborhood or a group of villages. On average in Bihar, that serves about 2,000 customers, slightly over 2,000 customers depending on the area. So when we talk about losses and that sort of aggregate loss being unknowable, the first thing to think about is to zero in on the grid and to look at the individual feeders to see what is going on down there. But of course, you can only look if there's something there to measure. And the important prerequisite for any kind of scheme and what the discoms have accomplished in the last year, so this is just in sort of 6 districts that have been selected for prioritization, is an increase in feeder level metering. So the baseline metering is sort of less than 50%, and many of these areas have more than doubled feeder level metering in the last year. And this was directly as a result as coordination efforts from sort of JPAL and IGC as well, which was identifying areas that might be prioritized for this revenue collection scheme and saying, okay, let's see if these can reach the frontier of 100% metering, which is necessary to pin down this revenue coming from. Once you have that, once you can measure the flow of power, you can use that to compare to the flow of revenue. Power is going out, revenue is coming in. And what we sort of normalize, or the units we put that in, are as a share of the cost of that power purchase. So the cost, if you include the cost of service, is about rupees 5.5, a little over 5 rupees per unit. A unit is a kilowatt hour. So we express this revenue rate as the total collection over the total cost at that rate as a percentage. And the revenue rate tells you, whether supply to a certain area is sort of fiscally sustainable in the sense it's self-funding. And if you look across feeders, just in these sort of districts which had been sort of selected for the prioritization, you see that revenue rate is very variable and very low on average. So that is, there are a number of areas where the revenue rate is 20%, even 40% is quite an achievement in this context. So this is basically striking both for the level and for the dispersion, that there are some areas that are paying, but there are some areas that have very low rates of payment. And sort of the next question, keeping that horizontal axis as this revenue rate, which is running from 0 to 100%, is how is that related to the power supply that these feeders are getting? So each dot in this figure is a relationship between revenue rate and hours of supply running from 0 to 24 on the vertical axis. And what you can see is there is a relationship, but really you probably couldn't have known that if we hadn't drawn the line for you. If you just look at the points, it's a very kind of loose relationship. And what the line shows is that if you went from a revenue rate of 0, not paying at all, to a revenue rate of 100, every consumer paying their bill, that would get you, in the present scenario, about 2 hours more per day of electricity, which is quite small given that large increase in payment. And moreover, what you can see is that there's a huge heterogeneity in the hours of supply at these feeders. So some feeders are getting only 4 or 6 hours today, and some are getting 24-hour supply. So how is it that this data and this matching of revenue and supply could be used to make an improvement in this situation and bring those sort of dots that are in the lower left-hand corner, if you will, up to the upper right-hand corner, to 24-hour supply and to higher rates of payment. So we've developed with the discoms schedules which map the revenue rates to the number of hours of supply per day. And these are separate mappings for rural areas and for urban areas. And the urban areas is meant sort of smaller towns, not district headquarters. Those are sort of excluded. All of them were prioritized for 24-hour supply. So these schedules then run from, for example, in the case of an urban area, 12 to 24 hours based on the revenue rates. And what happens, how these schedules are designed, is that the average supply at the current rates of payment, given suppose everyone stayed at the same rate of payment, the average supply would not change. That is, the middle category, by design, is about what these areas in rural and urban areas are getting at present. So there's no change in the average supply. And moreover, the bottom of the schedule, if you look at the very bottom, even revenue rate of 0, you're getting 10 or 12 hours a day, which is more than the power supply that these areas are getting now. So now if you recall that figure I showed, the minimum is 4 or 6 hours at a minimum. So this is raising the bottom, keeping the middle about the same, and also sort of raising the top. That is, you can achieve, this is the sort of final point, a continuous 24/7 supply of power with a revenue rate of only 60%. And that's an acknowledgement that subsidy is basically here for some time. We're not talking about sort of throwing out of subsidy. The difference between the cost of supply and the payments is simply too great for that to be viable. But rather, this 60% rate, which is still a partial covering of cost, would enable 24/7 power supply. So this sounds like a sort of nice idea. It's modeled on a scheme that has apparently done very well in the state of Maharashtra and increased sort of power supply and decreased losses there dramatically. Question is, could it work in Bihar? And what would you sort of expect to be the result of this scheme? So in the spirit of research and in the spirit of IGC, we had partnered with the North Bihar Power Distribution Company Limited to try this out in 2 districts, in Saran and Siwan, in basically the beginning of this year, January and February, just for 2 months, and for a small number of feeders for which data was available at that time. So about 48 feeders in total out of 85 feeders in these 2 districts. And the design of this pilot was specifically a randomized controlled trial so that we could test whether this scheme had the sort of benefits that we forecast, that is, mainly greater revenue. And the randomized controlled trial means that these feeders were not all shifted onto the scheme. Rather, the feeders were selected, this group of 45, and half of them were randomly assigned to be shifted onto the scheme. The benefit of that design is that once we've randomly selected that half from the larger group, we can be very confident that they're comparable at the start to the rest of the group, and therefore any change we see, any difference in the revenue we see afterwards, can be due only to the implementation of this scheme. And that's sort of a very important aspect of the design. So what did we see? After 2 months, and this is without any publicity of the scheme, just implementing these schedules that I showed you on the earlier slide, these treatment feeders, about 20 plus odd treatment feeders, saw an increase of revenue of 1 rupee per unit, and the control feeders saw basically no change whatsoever, which is exactly what you expect. They're on the status quo. That's what a control group does. But what's interesting here is 1 rupee per unit. Gee, how much is that? That seems like not so great an amount, but it's important. The base payment rate in these areas was about rupees 0.95, so 95 paisa per unit. So an increase of 1 rupee in these areas is more than a doubling of payment in 2 months. So what happened to bring that about? Well, mainly, if you supply more power to areas which are paying more, then the average unit of power you supply will get a higher rate of payment because you're allocating it to those places with a higher payment rate. However, there's also some evidence, even in this very short span of time, that some of the consumers within the non-paying areas took it upon themselves to increase the payment in response. And this is very important because what this means is that if you implemented this scheme over a greater number of months and you did some publicizing, some marketing, you would expect that dynamic to be much stronger. That is, there would be much greater incentive effects of more consumers increasing the payment rate. And what that means, given the schedules I described, is that at current payment rates, hours of supply would be constant, but at greater payment rates, supply would also grow. So this incentive effect is a sort of beneficial feedback between the supply, and the payments. So lastly, on what could be done to sort of build on this result. Now, this is only a pilot, and it was implemented for a very brief period of time prior to the elections. So what could be done to sort of learn more about this and to get closer to those aspects of economic growth that I described at the start? So these sort of 6 districts had been selected for preparations for meter, basically meter installation at the feeder level, which is the main prerequisite for any kind of feeder-linked revenue scheme. And the plan that is possible is basically to roll out over the course of this summer and the rest of this year this revenue-linked supply scheme in those 6 districts and measure the impacts through sort of extensive field work, surveying of households and businesses, and by the end of this year to be back hopefully in a forum like this with the IGC and presenting results at least with respect to revenue outcomes, increases in revenue, increases in hours of supply. We've sort of put a little bit later the end-line survey, which would link these revenue outcomes, which are kind of instrumental outcomes, to the kind of final outcomes you think of as growth-related. So that is the business and household changes. And for those, that can't be measured only with the books of the DISCOM and the financial health of electricity supply. That has to be measured by visiting households and businesses. So we've planned very ambitious survey efforts with targeting 16,000 respondents and over sort of 68,000 businesses to be enumerated. So enumerated basically just to count the business, its presence, its existence. And the rationale for that is that, if you run a tailoring shop and you switch from using a foot-operated sewing machine to an electric sewing machine, we want to see that. And we want to measure that, Bihar has progressed and electrification has occurred. And if you sort of offer right now a drink and you offer mainly sort of tea and water and you start offering cold drinks and you have thumbs up and that's refrigerated, we want to see that also. So it's not just the large-scale kind of manufacturing industry, but every aspect of life and productivity that we think is touched and therefore that we think should be covered with this survey effort. So that is the vision that we have for lighting up Bihar. And I would say, power is available in the broadest sense, that there have been deep structural changes in the electric power sector in India in the last 5 or 10 years, which in some sense make it easier, make it possible for states to take these great leaps in a short period of time. And a small number of states are starting on that route. And I hope I've sort of documented that Bihar has really made strides in the last 1 year to enable this rapid expansion of supply. And we think it's at a point where you can see this in the data, but maybe you can't yet feel it in the rural areas. And that will happen very soon. And I've singled out these 2 steps of finding out where does the revenue come from, and then sort of allocating the power supply in order to increase revenue and supply that might be sort of beneficial in accelerating this process. So that is the conception. Greater revenue leads to greater investment and greater power supply. And that's from the sort of narrow point of view of the electric power sector, but there's this broader point of view of sort of economic growth. And the traditional image one has in mind is a child studying by the light of a lamp. And this is an image I lifted from what's called the one lamp per child program, similar to one laptop per child. And I think it's very quaint. But this is not exactly what we have in mind. So we are also running a separate project on solar electrification. There's a project on solar electrification after this. These small-scale lamps could be an important part of that, could be an important part of the transition. But I don't think that this is lighting up Bihar, and I don't think this is what has occupied the mind of the government and made this such a charge. So what we have in mind is something more like this, which is a classroom which is well lit and which has fans to keep the students cool, and where, can you tell in that picture whether it's day or night outside? Here you can tell it's certainly night. Here you can't even tell. And that's mainly the point of electrification, is that it makes things possible in your life and in the economy you wouldn't even have thought of, and recedes into the background if it's being supplied well. So we're hopeful that this project would make some small contribution towards that kind of progress. Thank you.
Thank you, Nicholas. The revenue-linked supply scheme is a model which has been successfully experimented in Maharashtra, and thank you so much for showing the entire presentation, and subsequently I'll also be touching upon some of these issues very briefly though. Now we go to the next project. Our next speaker is David Szakonyi. He is a fifth-year doctoral candidate in the political science department at Columbia University and a research fellow at the Center for the Study of Institutions and Development at the Higher School of Economics in Moscow. His research interests include business strategy, political economy, international development, and clientelism. We request David for his presentation on the benefits of solar technology adoption, preliminary findings. Please, Mr. David.
Thank you very much. I'd first like to start off by thanking IGC Bihar for both the generous funding of the project that I'm about to present, the design and our conceptions up. It's at a very early stage, but also for organizing this fantastic conference so far, when I hope will continue to be fantastic over the next 2 days. As I was just introduced, my name is David Szakonyi. I'm from Columbia University. Oh, that's very important to my presentation. And today I'm going to be presenting a project called The Benefits of Solar Technology Adoption for Street Vendors in Bihar. And it's myself and my co-author, Johannes Orpelainen, who's a professor of political science at Columbia University as well, who cannot be with us today, but hopes to return to IGC Bihar in January, or hopefully this conference next year. So like I said, we are in the very early stages of this project. We have implemented the treatments, what I will describe in a couple slides starting in April. So I'd like to talk about the motivation. I'd like to talk about what we're trying to do. I'd like to get some feedback about how to improve it as we go to the midline and the end line, and get some thoughts about the overall trajectory of where we are right now. So today, I don't have two research questions that are going to be framing my talk. First is, who adopts solar technology? And here I have in mind exactly, and I'd like to build on the last presentation because it provides a perfect setup for where I'm going to talk about today. It is the importance of electrification for growth, for business productivity, especially micro enterprises, which I'm going to concentrate on today, and also technology adoption, which in the larger literature on development and business and micro enterprise is becoming much prominent and an important factor determining why some businesses succeed and why some businesses fail. And part of that is about the type of technology they adopt, and we're going to be focusing on solar. And secondly, once they do adopt technological adoptions, how does that affect a whole variety of business-related outcomes, from their revenue and profit to the way that they reinvest, to the innovation and marketing schemes that they might adopt, and overall to their productivity. So again, who, when given the opportunity, adopts certain technologies, and secondly, what are the effects of that technology on their micro enterprise? And today I'm going to be talking about a very specific population in India, but it's also prominent around the world and is very large in number, and that are urban street vendors. And as we all know, having traveled India or having traveled Africa or South Asia, these people are very, very visible, but not always incorporated in some of the developmental plans of larger governmental policy. And so that overlooking kind of creates a sense of vulnerability, and by ignoring them, we're missing a key piece in the way that micro enterprises become small enterprises and medium-sized enterprises, and the way that business acumen gets fostered at a very low level and people learn how to run a business. And a lot of that starts literally on the street. So again, this is a very large and underserved population. There are 10 million estimated street vendors in India. Since most of these are in the informal sector, they don't show up in the common enterprise surveys that are done by the World Bank and other organizations. So coming up with an exact number is very, very difficult. But as of about 2008, 2009, the number is at 10 million. Again, they're predominantly represented by the urban poor, and they're considered the second largest employment subgroup in the informal sector after small-scale manufacturing, such as textiles. So again, they're not registered with authorities. Many of them are not keeping any formal account information or balance sheets, but they are running businesses, and they're taking in profits every single day, and they're continuing to work in that respect. So to give you a little sense about what the situation is like in Patna, in Bihar, where we're going to be talking about today, I'm going to present the results first of a baseline survey that we conducted in January that's going to helping us design this project, helping us implement it. So there we contracted with the very renowned survey firm Morsel to talk with 1,000 urban street vendors from 24 different markets in Patna and Hajipur. So what we did is we had a team, about 15 different surveyors or enumerators, go out to 24 marketplaces that we identified by working with a local organization. And they went and got the phone numbers and the contact information of over 4,000, and we randomly sampled from that 4,000, 1,000 to be included in the survey. There's good variety across a lot of different demographic characteristics that I'm going to talk about. But the first one is that 15% of respondents were female, which I guess was probably the first thing that jumped out. Was a little bit surprising that there are that many women that are working in this sector, and that's going to provide a very interesting dimension for some of the work that we have in store. And the survey that we implemented had about 12 different modules that talked everything about how they run their businesses on a daily basis, but also where they're from, their migration, and their relations with authorities that happened 2 or 3 months before the election. So we talked about that dimension as well, and crime, theft, anything you could think of was on this survey, just so we can get a better picture of who we're working with. So what is this population, and what kind of characteristics really define them? First is that there's a very high level of illiteracy. Over 34% cannot read or write. And the average amount of schooling was only 5 years, the average amount. So these people have been not really integrated into the education system as we know right now. And 53% utilize some sort of ration card. And we spelled out a couple different varieties of that, but they're very, very poor, at least from an urban perspective. The daily household income was roughly about $5, about 300 rupees. But for households that average 7 persons, we also asked them about their commitments to relatives outside of their immediate household, and many of them said that they regularly give money to upwards of 5 or 10 uncles, cousins, and things like that that don't live in the household. So the monetary burden is very large, and they carried an average debt level of 25,000 rupees. And we saw that as again, a huge impediment to growing business, partly because that's having from marriage commitments and from upgrading their household and things like that. 90% of respondents were from scheduled tribes, castes, and other backward castes. So what we have the sense is that people are running in some sense, very well-run businesses. Like they are making a profit, and that they're continuing to do this for 7, 8 years in a row and working on average 70 hours a week, but they're facing a lot of different obstacles to growing their business beyond a certain threshold. So what are some of the obstacles that we identified of really why these micro-enterprises are struggling and what could make them more profitable moving forward? And this is kind of reflects the laundry list of obstacles that micro-enterprises face around the world. First, secure property rights. Problems staying in the land that they would like to sell on. Sometimes they have to move or are forced by authorities or evicted from where they're living. And the municipal authorities often extract bribes. We have about 15% that had to pay a bribe within the last 3 months, and the bribes are substantial, sometimes upwards of 30 or 40% of their daily revenue. Just for that, and the inspector might come back in 3 or 4 days and take another cut. There's what we call the local goons that are thugs that are running protection markets that are extracting revenue that way for security and forcing vendors to contribute some of their revenue to these local, we call them criminals in some sense. Theft and violence in the marketplace, credit constraints, they're very outside of the formal credit system, and they have really documented problems getting money to finance relations with suppliers, and when those contracts break down, having to pay for some of those things. And the last thing I'm going to really focus on for the whole talk is the access to infrastructure. So electricity, water, et cetera, that any business would need, but again, electricity is so key here because vendors have to sell when their customers are available to buy. And that's not always during the day when the sun is shining. And it's after work when people are returning home and need to pick up things for their life. And the sun is just not available to help them with that. So in terms of lighting and electrification, bringing it back to the last presentation, so where do they get lighting right now? And we can see that about 34%, or a little bit more than 35% are actually connected to the grid. They're in places where they have a regular hookup and they're sometimes paying, sometimes not. There's a lot of illegal connections where they're tapping in, but they do have access to either the grid or to the generator and are able to charge mobile phones or batteries and things like that. They have lamps, but again, if we look to the right of this graph, we can see that almost 10% use candles to light their shop, almost 10% don't have any sort of lighting at all, and others are just using street lamps or very polluting kerosene lamps to light their shops. So again, there's a wide variety of different sources that are being used, but as we're going to see, this is identified as a very large obstacle to how they're growing their business. Next, how much does this lighting cost? Again, the variation across the different sources is huge, with some vendors paying almost 50 rupees a day for regular electricity usage, and then people either stealing or not having any light or paying nothing, which is an average of 10 rupees per day to light their shop. We are trying to lower that, and we're trying to improve both the quality of the electricity that they're getting through a sustainable intervention. And although we see the grid as the ultimate destination that we want to work towards, because different problems in implementing it and constructing grid infrastructure near these vendors, we are thinking of more stopgap solutions in the midterm to get the microenterprises working more effectively, working more productively, and improving their income today instead of having to wait for the grid infrastructure to be implemented in the future. So, is lighting really a problem? And we find that it is a top priority among 80% of street vendors. It trails relations with municipal authorities. That's the only problem that was identified that was more important than electricity for these small enterprises. And it even comes before credit constraints. So that when talking to these micro enterprises, they're more worried about where they're getting lighting solutions from, how much they're paying for them, how consistent they are, and what kind of problems they're dealing with them, than they are necessarily about getting access to more money on the daily basis. And it's only relations with thugs or the authorities or the police that are more important to them, and it's about 90% of them identified that as a top priority. So electricity is right there in terms of what needs to be solved for them to help grow their business. And lastly, we asked them in this baseline of 1,000 vendors, what would electricity do for you? And again, I highlight some differences between the genders here, but the totals are actually important. 88% said they would allow them to attract more customers, 86% would said them allowed to work longer hours, and 32% said they would allow them to charge higher prices for the goods that they sell. And I'd like to highlight that the 15% of vendors that were female are significantly more likely to answer yes to all three of those questions than the male. So the females are more optimistic about the way that lighting can help them improve their business than the male respondents by pretty significant margins, 4, 7%, 8%. So we're seeing potential to help a certain subgroup of this population really, really grow their businesses if given the opportunity to do so. So what do we know about electricity and microenterprise development? We know that electricity provision can definitely help spur income generation and productivity, whether it's the spinning wheel on a textile machine or it's lighting up your shop to work longer hours, that there's a lot of opportunities to make more money immediately. Just like in mobile phones, technological adoptions can have immediate effects. However, the literature has found in the last 3 or 4 years that there's actually a much more heterogeneity in these effects than a lot of academics and a lot of policymakers seem to acknowledge. And first is that not all firms uptake optimal technology for their firms. There's a ton of examples with fertilizer and different manufacturing practices around the world about firms having the opportunity to adopt various technologies but declining for various reasons, because of information asymmetries or deficiencies. You name it, the mechanisms are across the board, but not all firms, no matter what their size are, choose to do so. And secondly, linking to electricity grids themselves is not always sufficient to help get firms off the ground. You need a lot of other complementarities, but our knowledge of what those complementarities right now is kind of incomplete. is that markets aren't developed enough, that you need to have pre-existing demand in order to take advantage there? Do you need other complementary infrastructure or revenue collection in order for people in order for the businesses to access electricity and know how to use it? And lastly, do you need more credit available to these businesses so that when they can work longer hours, when they can upgrade to the next technology, that they have the financing in order to do so? So in summary, electrification, we know in a lot of respects, and we have seen positive effects on microenterprise development, but there are also a lot of complementary obstacles that we need to address while tackling this problem. We also don't have a lot of evidence from the kind of randomized control trial perspective about what electricity can actually do for microenterprises. So in response, over the last year, we've designed an intervention that we're currently implementing in Patna with this group of 1,000 urban street vendors to address this deficiency or these problems with the consistency of electrical provision. So here we adopt the perspective of a randomized control trial to randomly distribute access, and the keyword is access to solar lights for 500 microenterprise owners in Bihar, these urban street vendors. So again, we're going to split the population of 1,000 into two groups, a treatment and control, each of roughly about 500 members, and they're going to be distributed geographically across the entire region of Patna, and there are two markets in Hajipur, and half of them are going to be offered the opportunity to rent 5-watt LED lights that are going to be powered each day from a central charging station within the marketplace. So we put a lot of thought into what intervention has the most potential to actually have an effect to increase uptake and get vendors to pay for electricity. Because we don't want to subsidize it outright, because that is going to instill a set of expectations that are not sustainable. So how can we get vendors both excited and interested in this technology, but also able to pay for it over a long period of time? So we consulted the literature, we consulted the baseline, and we came to the conclusion that the best way was not to sell upright with some kind of credit scheme, but was to rent access at a subsidized price. That was both leaning on some studies that have been done of urban street vendors electrification in India, but also talking to the vendors themselves with qualitative interviews and getting to know what the best way for them to plan out their businesses and the best way for us to supply it. So we kind of concluded the idea that a centralized charging station of about 20 to 25 lights in a marketplace cluster where you sell access for about 5 to 7 rupees per day, it was the optimal way to get this to the vendors and get them interested in adopting it. How do we do that? Well, we actually have to recruit a new class of entrepreneur to A, help install and demonstrate the benefits of the solar panels to the urban vendors, and B, collect revenue over time so that it can be filtered back up to the supplier of the solar lights and that contract can be fulfilled. So there's a couple different dimensions. One is we are going to be selecting clusters of which to randomize who will get access to technology and who will not. But then we're also going to be basically starting small businesses in these marketplaces that are going to be renting out electricity from the solar panels to the enterprise owners and create hopefully a virtuous cycle where the entrepreneurs are going to be able to pay the original contractor who's going to provide the solar lights. To do so, we're working with a local NGO, Nidan, who's got extensive experience working in these marketplaces. They've helped organize marketplace committees. They've worked for the last decade with urban street vendors and have a long list of contacts across the board. And also with the local provider of solar lights, Power Green, that's going to help provide these central charging stations, but also that all the revenue is not going to be paid up front by the grant or by us, but there's going to be a continuous revenue stream from the vendors back to Power Green. And Power Green can use this after hopefully after the intervention is over to offer access to the other 500 that are not in our sample, and then even broader vendors that never even entered our survey. We're going to adopt an intent to treat approach with these 500 vendors from what we call 38 marketplace clusters. And again, we don't want to force technology adoption by these vendors. We want to offer it to them, try to convince them of it, study who adopts and who doesn't, and then study the effects of those who adopt. So that involves in-person demonstrations by Power Green in order to do so, and the entrepreneur possibly given the opportunity for 3-4 days of completely subsidized access to the light to show the vendors the immediate type of benefits that they can expect from installing these lights in their stands. The type of assignment we're going to use is just simple randomization clustered at the marketplace level. We'd love to be able to, every other vendor offer a light, but there's problems with implementation there because of the renting model that we've chosen. So the central charging station requires us to identify clusters of somewhere between 20 to 40 vendors at a time and randomize at that level. And again, there's going to be clusters in the treatment group, clusters in the control group, and any effect that we find across all these different measurements that I'm going to be talking about, we're going to attribute solely to the idea, or to the fact that we offered access to the solar lights to one group and not the other. What do we hope to happen? So the first set of hypotheses deal with that first research about who adopts. And this is really important because it involves the type of persuasion that is needed or the type of impediments that vendors might see in their business in order to adopt this type of technology. So we first hypothesized that vendors with more education and business ability, which we measure in a couple different ways that are standard in the literature, are going to be more likely to adopt solar lighting technology in their stands. Some of this technology is not simple to understand, and some of the benefits of what lighting can do for the stands are not immediate, and they're not obvious, even when there's an entrepreneur there and even when the installation company is there doing its job. So we expect that the more capable, in some sense, the more business competence that some of the vendors have, that's going to be correlated with their willingness and their interest in adopting this technology. Second, there's an interesting strand in the literature about this type of micro enterprises, and that not all of them have dreams of growing their business to huge enterprises and supermarkets and just moving up the chain. And some are there because they couldn't find employment in other sectors. Is that they're selling on the street, hoping to find a better job along the way, but they need to find an income now in order to support their families. We would call them wage workers. But they're wage workers that see vending as a short-term solution to some of their income problems. They're going to have a very different approach to running their business than what we might call a natural entrepreneur who's in it for the long run, who's optimistic about the way that his stand or business can grow over the next 10 years. And even given a lucrative outside option to join the labor force in a different capacity, might actually be more interested in remaining a vendor than exiting. So these two different classes might be correlated with who's interested in adopting an innovation and making a reinvestment in their stand. Whereas if you're just there because you can't find another job, the inner workings and the type of improvements to increase your revenue might not be as attractive than if you're there in order to grow your business over the long term. And the last one is that there's going to be a conditional effect on what you did before. That if you're happy with your lighting solution or you're paying a good price or you have good grid access, you might not easily see the benefits of going over to a more solar efficient, sustainable source, less polluting, because you're happy with the solution that you have. So we don't expect necessarily homogeneous treatment effects across everyone. It's going to be conditional on what kind of access you had before. And secondly, we're going to talk about today the economic benefits of what we think might happen. Here we see that there are two possible mechanisms about how microenterprises could develop given this opportunity to adopt technology. First is that they are decreasing the price of one of their critical inputs by about 30%, about 4 rupees a day. Their average profit or average revenue per day is about 200. So this is not inconsequential. It's a non-negligible decrease in one input. We don't think a lot of the potential effects of this intervention are going to happen through this cost-cutting scheme. We think a lot of it's going to happen by them working longer hours. And by drawing on some other studies that have been done in Africa, we think that given the opportunity to work 3, 4, 5 more hours into the night and attract potentially a more wealthy customer who's returning after work will help them increase their sales by a much larger factor than necessarily what would happen if they just paid nothing for their electricity. So we're going to be looking at the way that these two mechanisms might be complements or substitutes, and which is going to be stronger in terms of incentivizing vendors to grow their business. And so we're going to be looking at the way that access to solar increases sales revenue at night. How does it help them work during times where they previously could not? And last, we're going to talk about access to solar lighting increasing investment in business expansion. So if they do have more revenue, who is going to reinvest it? And who's going to renegotiate with suppliers? Who might take on different products? Who's going to think a little bit more creatively about the way to differentiate their own stand from the other 30 stands that are in their immediate proximity in order to take this opportunity of lowering inputs and working longer hours? And these are some of the critical questions that we're interested in answering. How are we going to do so? Well, as I just mentioned, we just did a baseline survey of 1,000 vendors that are going to be included in our study over the next 3 years. And we're going to follow up with a midline after 6 months and an endline in 12 months. The midline is going to be this fall. Again, these are going to include very similar models to what we did in the baseline, about a whole range of business outcomes. So first off, did they adopt the technology? Did they buy into the rental scheme that we offered them? Secondly, how did their business potentially change, or what are the differences in business activities between the treatment and control groups? How much did they spend on fuel? How many hours did they work? How many hours of lighting do they have now compared to the past? Revenue. New and old customers. If we can identify that they're attracting new or more wealthier customers, or potentially more female customers who are attracted by the safety that a well-lit marketplace can offer, how does that affect the way that their business is developed? The type of savings, their input prices, and the amount of reinvestment that they're putting in the business. So just from an economic standpoint, how does technology affect these different aspects of the way that their businesses are run? We'd also like to get creative with different indirect measures of income, such as an asset index. Do they improve their cell phone? Are they able to buy any other household appliances over the course of the 12 months that they're involved? Where does that money go that they were potentially making from the technology? And how does that affect their consumption patterns? Not all vendors have the same type of commitment patterns as well. Some send remittances back to the rural regions from which they migrated. Some have large extended families who are continuously asking them for money in order to support themselves. Does the money that they're making from their stands get diverted to these other family members or these other commitments, or is it being reinvested into the business? And what type of worker decides which part of that trade-off to make? Who is concentrated on maybe putting off short-term consumption for increased long-term gains, thinking about the way that they might have some present bias in their time preferences, and who's more concerned about just consuming now and potentially exiting the market if given the opportunity? And lastly, we'd like to introduce something of attrition. We have cell phone numbers for all of these vendors, and the ones that we can't find, we'd like to know why they stopped, where they moved, and what they're doing right now. So this is kind of a thing that's another thing overlooked in the microenterprise literature is, how does market exit work, and what happens to these guys when they decide to close up their shop, and where do they go from there? So we're very interested in attrition and identifying people 12 months down the road. Just as a side note, I'd like to talk about some of the interesting dimensions that we identified from the baseline that we're going to be pursuing. One is this gender effect, looking at the role of inter-household bargaining, the power that a woman has within her household in terms of negotiating with her husband, the revenue that she gets, and how much it must be devoted to the family or to her own private consumption patterns, and how much might not be. And also attracting female customers. We see a large difference between the amount of money that female customers buy from the average stand compared to male customers, and fear among female customers about the safety of a marketplace as a deterrent for buying and being part of this public life. So we're especially interested in some of the gender effects of allowing or enabling some of these marketplaces to be better lit. Also talk a little bit about community effects, and also just to kind of wrap up, about misallocation. So from a strictly economic sense or a technical sense, we're harmonizing the cost of one input across the board for all vendors in the treated marketplaces, whereas some of them had access to very expensive generators and some of them had to steal electricity from the grid. Now they all have one opportunity to pay one price for a consistent supply of energy. How does that affect the way that the markets are run and the way that other resources are allocated when you harmonize this one aspect of their micro enterprises? So we're very interested in measuring market size and contrasting between the treatment and control groups about the differences in the overall market dynamics once this technology has been offered to every single participant. So just to give you a highlight or a sense of update of where we are so far, this is what the light does. This is a marketplace. I think this is the Gandhi Maidan marketplace, actually right down the road. You can see that the lamp is suspended over the different fruits and vegetables that he's selling, and that I think in this picture you can see 15 of them all in a row that have adopted so far. So right now we have 158 vendors of the potential 500 that have already signed up from 8 marketplaces clusters of the 38. So we're about a little less than a third through the installation over the past 6 weeks, and we've got about 2 or 3 more installations coming up this week that I'm really excited to see how they're going. The feedback so far has been very positive. The lights are durable, and the vendors are happy so far. We're having much fewer problems, or many less problems with payment than we thought that we would, and with attrition about vendors backing out. It seems once they start to see the way the technology is affecting in the first place, that a lot of times vendors don't have free choice, or micro enterprises don't have free choice about what they can and can't do, because there are other roofs on top of them, or other rackets that are dictating how economic activity is going to be run in these places. And we've run into a fair amount of problems in some of our treatment clusters about local criminals not wanting this type of technology. So as a kind of lesson learned so far is knowing the context and knowing the environment of how business is conducted is extremely important. And we've had some success convincing some of these local strongmen to get on board, and other times not at all, and having to work through other channels in order to allow vendors to innovate. Another one is the minimum size for such a system of solar technology can slow technological adoption. If we could come up with a rental program where we could give out individual lights, it would be much easier than having a central charging station where we're worried about securing land for the solar panels to sit all day, getting an entrepreneur to run this small business or a small organization to help distribute it, than we would be to just having individual transactions. It seems like it would be easier on this kind of economies of scale to go up one level, but because of problems with registration, because of problems with municipal authorities and with land, there are strong trade-offs between the two models, and we're going to think pretty creatively over the next 6 months about ways to overcome them. Just to conclude about where we're headed, we have a midterm survey planned for October 2014. And we're also thinking about a cross-cutting treatment, and we're applying for some money right now to alleviate credit constraints for a portion of the vendors. So we from the very get-go, we understood that there's going to be these heterogeneous treatment effects, and there's going to be these other obstacles that might affect the way that technology is implemented, and the biggest one is probably going to be credit. We can't fix their relations with their authorities. We can't get them registered in the short term, but we can hopefully give them some kind of cash and see what they would do when they have both the cash and the technology in hand. Again, talking about misallocation, coming up with new ways of estimating market size to see the wider economic implications of this kind of study. And then using the surveys to understand other aspects of the marketplace environment, such as pricing discrimination based on caste and ethnicity, vendor self-organization, these committees that exist that help structure the way that transactions are made, contracts are fulfilled, and disputes are resolved. They play really important roles in the way that some vendors are able to grow to pretty substantial sizes and other ones are kept very small. So we're very interested in the way that market structure works in this unique environment. And then, like I talked about, attrition and improved knowledge of entry and exit. Why are some vendors unsuccessful, and where do they go afterwards? And where are new vendors coming from, and how are they identifying different marketplaces in order to enter? So thank you very much. Hopefully in a year we'll have results, positive results from the intervention, and we can take it from there. So.
Thank you, David. We are racing against time. I'd just like to briefly introduce the discussant for David Szakonyi's presentation, Sourabh Paul. He completed his doctoral degree in economics from University of British Columbia, and now he is an assistant professor in IIT Delhi in the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences.
Thank you, David and Nicholas. It's really, really interesting and fantastic projects. And thank you, IGC Bihar, for supporting these projects. I have 3 important comments because this is an ongoing project. So what we'd like to do, I'll just highlight 3 important areas so that we can receive more comments from the audience quickly. So we all know that there is no sensible person who will deny that importance of technology. Like as sometimes Nicholas said that technology or electricity is not a bullet, it is actually behind every possible bullets behind growth. So in fact, like there is growing evidence of difference in technology explaining inequality at local level and global level we have already. Now, one catch-up mechanism is this technology diffusion and adoption by poorer section. So this is one type of mechanism. Now, this is very important to have this type of micro-level study where we start study the importance of, or what are the mechanisms behind this adoption process. So one of the important questions you try to address through this project is who adopts and why they adopt this technology. In literature, the focus has been largely on in agricultural sector, but recently, particularly last 5 or 6 years, mobile technology or different types of ICT in education and so on. So this is very important. And this study is also important to understand the adoption process in a different setup, urban, informal setup. In that aspect also, this is very important. Okay. Now, if technology adoption or diffusion is a major challenge through which poorer section can develop, and also if somehow we can actually address that challenge, then probably this process of slower growth in poorer section can be overcome. Okay. Now, when you talk about technology adoption, there are two things. One is this technology, which is nothing but from a mapping from input to output in very technical term, and adoption is using this new mapping as well as how you are allocating the inputs. Okay. So when a technology adoption is incomplete or it's not working perfectly, then we have to understand both, like why some of them are not adapting, and at the second time when they're adapting, why the allocation is not happening properly. Right? So this study, particularly your study, helps to understand some of these constraints on adoption process, who adopts and why they adopt, and impact on income generation. So I was going through some of your hypotheses. So these are all hypotheses at this stage. So one comment here is that maybe like in later stage you may see some the hypothesis 3, 4, and 5 where you study the economic impact. It seems like very much straightforward. So I think probably once you have this data collection process is done and you have more evidence at your hand, then probably you can see much more important economic and social impact. So there you can refine your hypothesis. So that is one thing. And there also then you can understand what sort of intervention is required at the policy level. So whether through market or what kind of incentive you have to give, whether subsidization of this type of green technology would work, why market is not filling this gap. So as you were saying. So one important flag you highlighted is this gundas, like local criminals who are actually controlling this sort of business dealings. Okay. So in literature we see that in general there are 3 important determinants. In your hypothesis 1, you are highlighting one, like education. Adoption and schooling are positively correlated throughout. Net of all other important determinants. That somehow it's your hypothesis 1. But at the same time, you say that in your data, in your baseline survey, you have 34% no education at all. And average schooling is 5 years. So I don't know whether you'll be able to kind of exploit the variation in education level properly to see how education is playing role in this particular project. I'm not sure. Like I think that's not a problem. And also the other important determinants is that income of the unit. So wealthier and larger units are more likely to adapt, that we know. And also that relationship is not necessarily linear. So this is also closely related to your hypothesis 2 and hypothesis 3. Spillover effect, like if you have prior knowledge of this adoption by your neighbor, so suppose in a particular segment, street, you give this technology, and then how the spillover effect is going on, how we are going to capture that. And now, the thing is, what is not so clear, not necessarily in your paper, but in general, that how this education and adoption, schooling and adoption relationship works. Like, is it like they have some superior knowledge, those who are more educated, they have some superior knowledge so that they're ready to adapt, or they have some forward-looking behavior. Like if I'm more educated, then I'm less risk averse, or I have more forward-looking behavior. So through which mechanism this education and adoption of new technology is working. Okay, so that is important. And then you talked about business ability and adoption relationship somewhere. So I don't know what you mean by this business ability and how we're going to measure it. So I'm not sure that part. The second hypothesis was wage workers are less likely to adopt this technology. First of all, this is important thing to know. Like if you are getting this empirical evidence, but is it like I think probably at the end you explained this is some sort of transitory behavior. Like they are not sure whether they will be in this business or not. That's why they don't want to invest in this technology. Is it like that, or they don't want to take this sunk cost so that if they want to go back to their own the earlier occupation? So what is going on there? At the end, I would like to say this is unique experiment, as I have highlighted, urban setting as well as informal sector. And I hope it would highlight some of the important questions in literature, like role of education, learning, the group behavior, operational scale you highlighted already, credit constraint. So some of them are really huge credit. And competing technology, like alternative source of energy. We have already skewed price in India, energy price. Environmental issues, that's again big thing. I don't want to bring everything together here, but later definitely there's, and gender effects you have highlighted. So again, like if you see that they're saving, their revenue is increasing and they're saving their cost, so if this is, all these economic outcomes are so strong and visible, then can market play a role, like filling this gap? Like if market cannot play a role, if you have some sort of evidence that market is not filling, why is it so? Okay, so if we understand how each of these channels work, then probably like making policy would be easier for us. And thank you again for taking these projects. Very interesting. Thank you so much.
Now we open this floor for this questions. May I request the person who is asking the question, please introduce yourself and the question to whom that would be directed to. Please.
Thank you. I'm Lakshmi Iyer from Harvard University, and this is a question for David. It's a follow-up on some of Sourabh's comments, which is exactly why doesn't the market supply this technology? I mean, the vendors you're talking about are clearly capable of adopting technology. Every single one of them has a cell phone. So, and they're somehow able to charge that cell phone too. So it's not that they don't have a facility to charge things. It's not that they don't understand new technology, which can be productivity improving. So so you highlighted some barriers when you tried to supply this, right? And the barriers were related to property rights, to power relations. But your experiment is not trying to relax those constraints. So I was a bit concerned that so either it is not financially sustainable, and that's why they're not adopting it, and that's why the market is not supplying it, in which case then you have to worry about, would this have to be permanently subsidized? Or you have to wonder if it's about these gundas and so on, that they are just biding their time, and once your project exits, then they'll be back to the status quo. So I don't know how you want to think about this issue.
That's a great comment. A very good question. We don't find that gundas are dominating every single marketplace. They're probably at about 2 or 3%. About 3 or 4 we've had problems there. So, and relaxing the gunda constraint is probably outside of our capabilities as researchers. I would love to, but right now I'm unaware of how to do that. We find that we talked about 4 different suppliers when we did the tender about who would be interested in participating with us. And some of them had actually tried in the marketplaces and found it financially viable. One first thing was the cost, that they were unaware of the willingness to pay of some of the vendors, that they didn't have a good assessment of what the market or the demand was for this type of lighting solution. And once we both gave them, we got about 20% subsidy of the lighting, and talked to these suppliers about the practicalities of implementation, they were much more interested and gave very nice offers, very good proposals for working with us. So I think it's a bit of information on both sides, that the vendors are not as interested in adoption because they don't see the immediate benefits, and some of the suppliers don't understand both the willingness to pay, what the vendors are paying right now for their current sources and what they're willing to pay for solar, and also the different types of models that can be used to sustain the type of transactions between the vendors. So this rental model for the company that we're working for, it's new. They've never tried something like this before in some of the marketplaces. So it's a bit of innovation in that sense that we took a risk. But I also don't want to emphasize that we've had a lot of really good luck with most of the marketplaces that don't have Gundas, and we don't see Gundas everywhere, thankfully, or we'd be up a creek.
My question is to both Nicholas and David. Whether you refer to 24/7 supply, and you refer to business-related use of energy. I was wondering whether the survey question in your case, and in your presentation, which I joined late, did you consider asking people who need energy about the felt need for energy? As to for how many hours they needed the energy? But is it an a priori assumption that they need it 24/7? Or has it been surveyed, has it been studied as to for how many hours they need it? Or did they say it? How did this assumption emerge that they need it 24/7? Thank you.
So that's a good question. There are certainly some applications where you would think that it's important to get the first 8 hours or 10 hours. Irrigation comes to mind, where perhaps you've watered your field and the value of additional hours of supply is low. One thing which has actually happened alongside the introduction of a sort of revenue-linked supply scheme in other states is also the partitioning of supply for agriculture from the supply for domestic use, where I think that it's quite a safe assumption that people much prefer 24/7 availability. You cannot plan your life to fit into 8 hours or 6 hours a day. On the question, that's all I'll say, I guess.
3.6 hours is what the average of what they wanted. We asked them 3.6. No, 3.6 extra hours. So they definitely don't want it 24/7, but they want between 3 and 4 hours of lighting a day. It's really that after work market time that they can't get right now, and that's when most of the best paying customers are coming around, and they want to feel safe. So it's not many, but it's not being satisfied right now.
Can we have the last question because of the paucity of time? Yes?
My name is Ronald Abraham. I work with ID Insight and also the concurrent evaluation cell that's presently working with the holding companies in Bihar, the distribution holding companies in Bihar. And I have a question for Nick. So you demonstrated from your pilot there was a huge impact on the revenue rate. And you mentioned that there wasn't actually much advertising done in the field. So I wanted to get a sense of what do you think was the mechanism for that impact? A related question is that the revenue rate is, it's got the, to calculate the revenue rate, you're looking at the revenue and the supply. So can you also elaborate on, was it that the revenue increased or the supply decreased or both happened? What contributed to the increase in the revenue rate? And finally, given that you have seen such a huge impact, what else are you looking at when you're going to be evaluating it in the evaluation phase in the 6 districts?
So that's a lot to bite off on the first part, which is if there's no publicity, how did something change? Even if no one was aware of the scheme, the fact that you're giving more units of power to the places that are paying more will increase the revenue rate on average across all of the feeders. So that's the primary mechanism in the short term. However, there's also some inherent publicity in that people are aware when power supply has changed, they approach the power substation, they discuss with the linesman and so forth. And so there's that sort of small amount of natural publicity built in, and from that we believe there was some sort of change in behavior and increase in payment rates. On the last bit, as far as what are we measuring, we're sort of glad to discuss the survey instruments at length, and it's practically everything. I mean, it's profits, it's how you run your life, and so forth. So we'll talk about this offline.
Esteemed speakers, members of this august audience, first and foremost, for all the delegates who have come from outside Bihar, let me extend a very heartfelt welcome to a state where we worship not only the rising sun but also the setting sun. Being the last speaker before lunch, and I have some time constraint, I have to attend a meeting. It has its advantages and disadvantages. I'll be very brief. Taking it forward from what Nicholas has mentioned, in this sector, especially for some of us in the audience, I'll be very brief about these three sectors in energy. Coming to the generation, presently Bihar, as rightly mentioned by Nicholas, lowest per capita consumption in country, one of the lowest. It's 144. And it's one of the lowest. Generation, I think we are one of the lowest again in the country. I'm not giving you figures, but presently we are 110. We intend to move up to something like 700 by end of this financial year. And with the number of projects which are all ongoing, they're all ongoing, we intend to reach something like 5,000 to 6,000 megawatt by end of 2017. So, well begun is half done. I mean, the reforms mentioned by Nicholas, we have embarked on a very tough journey. It's a huge challenge, daunting task for us. Coming to the transmission, presently today, we have an evacuation capacity of something like 3,000 megawatt. And we hope to move up to 4,500 megawatt by next June. The biggest challenge is in the distribution sector, and more so in the sub-transmission and distribution system. Funds are not a constraint for us. Thanks to the initiative of the state government and to the support from the central government, various schemes, if I have to just add up all, whether it's BRGF or RAP, DRP schemes, or the state plan initiatives, the problem today is not of fund, but the problem is of convergence. We have to converge, and we have to see to it that the target, what is the deliverable which we are looking at, is to supply quality power, and this target of rural electrification is a huge challenge for us. What we intend doing is, in a very short journey, because this is one sector which does not give you time. Unlike roads and other sectors where you have a lot of time, you can plan it out. But this is one sector where on a day-to-day basis, you have to keep working. You have your challenges. You have to see the day-to-day problems, and at the same time, you have to work out on your reforms. We are working out on a lot of these reforms already. We have a new vendor policy in place. We have changed the payment policy existing in the board. And what we finally aim is, coming next year by, say, next August, what we are looking at is that presently we are supplying on an average 18 to 20 hours in the urban areas, and in the rural areas on an average it is 10 to 12 hours. But you know, it has its own challenges. The more power we are giving to rural areas, the more AT&C losses are there. We have to understand this contradictions also. So there are some fundamental challenges. As I said, funds are not a constraint. Something which will be dear to somebody like Mr. Satyajit. One of the biggest challenges, we have very few HT consumers compared to Gujarat and Maharashtra. There the percentage is 40 to 50%, and that is the reason why their AT&C losses are less. When Bihar it's these percentage is not even 10, and we have 90% LT consumers. So what it means is AT&C losses presently today in Bihar is something like 46%. And what we intend doing is to bring it down to 21% by 2021-22. That's a huge challenge. This is a target which we have set for ourselves and concurred by the Government of India. So, but that means a lot of rapid industrialization. So therefore, we have issues in, it will be interesting for some of you who would be understanding this sector, the 33 kV feeder lines. The thumb rule normally is 10 kilometers in urban areas and max 25 kilometers in rural areas. 11 kV, you'll be surprised, in Bihar on an average we have 60 to 70 kilometers of 11 kV feeder lines. Now, apart from other problems of the tail end, quality, power and other things, losses, what it means is if there is a small breakdown, it takes us hours to locate that fault, and then of course consequent problems are there. What we intend doing is, we want our 33 kV feeders, this is the average what I have told you, 10 kilometers in urban and 20 kilometers in rural. For 11 kV also, we have fixed our targets. These thefts are very common in this part of the world, Bihar in particular, and of course this is a national phenomena. I'm not talking about the white collared ones, but these things are very obvious. Now we have aerial bunch cabling system, the ABC. We intend in next 1 year to maximize this. We have funds, I have mentioned. The third problem is capacity of contractors. Today in the entire country, massive rural electrification work is going on. And to look for quality contractors who can deliver it on time, maybe before time, what we are doing is, we are revising our incentive policy. We want to incentivize. We want good people to come. We look at them as partners in development, not as contractors. And we want to incentivize our schemes. So, in this initiative, in this mission, what we are looking at the target, as the Honorable Ex-Chief Minister had mentioned last time, we are definitely, things have improved, but we have just begun. It's a long journey for us. We are aware of the daunting challenges. And in this journey, initiatives like RLSS, Revenue Linked Supply Scheme, this is a great initiative. We look forward to carrying on with such experiments. And I would like to congratulate Nicholas and his team, these young people who are sitting here. They are working with us. We look forward to more of these meaningful interactions. And we want to make use of your studies. And the trend, why I'll share this with you is, they were talking about feeders. What I did randomly was, in these 6 districts, I just had a look at the revenue figure, and to my, I will not say utter surprise to my players, and I was really happy to see the trend, is that the revenue is increasing in these 6 districts. So we look forward to this experiment also, and why not? I mean, areas which are paying us more, we should give them quality power. And coming to the industries, I think we are open to the open access also. The time has come when we should deliberate on these policies, which is going to help. I mean, every good industrialist looks at quality power, uninterrupted power. So we should now examine this open access system. So thank you so much for inviting me for this conference, Mr. Shehbal and his team. And I'm sorry, I'm racing against time. This is one sector. As I said, this is my first seminar as Secretary Energy. I would have loved to be here and to listen to more of you. Thank you so much. And lastly, for all of you who are from Patna and who are staying in that part of the world, Patliputra and other areas where you are facing problems, off the record, I hope media people are not going to quote me, off the record, yesterday I mentioned it will take us a week to repair. I assure you we will finish off the job by Monday evening. Kindly bear with us. Thank you so much.